Welcome, everybody. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Before I introduce today's panel, I would just like to flag a couple of events next week. On Monday at 10:30 a.m. EST, we have a webinar on the South African elections and their results and the new government. And on Wednesday, the 26th, at this time, we have a talk on Sumantro Matra's new book, The Sources of Russian Aggression. So I hope that many of you will be able to attend those. Today, we are going to discuss the Ukraine Peace Summit, so-called, this weekend, the G7 and its implications for the war in Ukraine, and President Putin's peace proposal, so-called, from last Friday. And to discuss this, have an extremely distinguished panel. John Mearsheimer, who will be known to all of you, is Professor of Political Science at Chicago University and generally regarded as the leading exponent of realist thought in the United States and the West today. And Kraatz is a non-resident fellow here at the Quincy and a former senior fellow at the Institute for Open Diplomacy, a French think tank. And Daniel Larison, also one of our non-resident senior, Daniel Larison contributes to Responsible Statecraft, is a contributing editor at antiwar.com and a former senior editor at the American Conservative. So welcome, everybody. Perhaps I could start, John, by asking you, what did you make of the Ukraine Peace Summit this weekend? Was it of any real significance, and if so, what? Does it mark any kind of step forward for Ukrainian peace?
No, I don't think it marks a step forward. I think it was basically a failure, and one could argue even that it backfired on the Ukrainians, who were pushing it very hard. I mean, the idea was to basically get the world behind Ukraine's peace proposal, its plan for ending this war. And they thought that they could hold this conference and invite pretty much every country in the world except Russia, and they could reach some sort of meaningful consensus on the proposal that the Ukrainians have on the table, and that this would put enormous pressure on the Russians, and they would make all sorts of concessions, and the Ukrainians in the West would end up winning in some meaningful way. This was delusional. Almost everybody, I think, understood that from the beginning, even before the conference was held. And once the conference was held, it was clear that this added up to pretty much nothing. I mean, lots of countries did not attend, especially countries like China, which really matter for making these sorts of things work. I think of the 92 countries that were there, 77 signed, but that means a big chunk didn't sign the final communique. And if you look at the final communique, it was basically pablum. It was really watered down from what the Ukrainians really wanted and didn't say much of all. So the end result is that this just doesn't add up to much. And if anything, exposes how weak the Western and Ukrainian position is at this point in time.
By the way, I forgot to say, questions from the audience, please place them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and I will pass on as many as I can to the panelists a bit later on. And do you concur with that? And is there an awareness in Europe now that these Ukrainian peace conditions are not in fact achievable?
Well, I think a lot of Europeans are under illusions still that Ukraine could win. Nobody ever mentions what winning means, but the public is very much divided. There's a piece of statistic that is rather interesting, though. Apparently, only 13% of French people wish for Russia to win, but then they don't want Ukraine to lose either. So that strikes me as rather interesting. But the situation in France, anyway, is very difficult to gauge because everybody is at each other's throats right now about many issues, but including the Ukrainian issue. But at the end of the day, there's some kind of a consensus emerging among those new parties that have been formed just a few days ago to run in the legislative elections, which Macron very unexpectedly called for. And almost all of them are for giving some kind of support to Ukraine, but up to a certain point only. And a couple of them don't want Ukraine to be coming into the European Union. And the actual summit that took place in Switzerland was largely fell under the radar because of the situation in France anyway, because of these elections. Really, there was a small banner headline underneath the TV screens saying, well, it can give anything, mentioning the people who didn't sign the final communique. There was one small element which may seem trivial, but it is actually not trivial. There was a mention of the number of children that should be returned to Ukraine in the event of a peace treaty, and that number was 20,000. Well, in France, for 2 years now, the number that was quoted very often by some of the NGOs that work on those subjects is 200,000. So we have an enormous difference in scale there. But as you know, numbers don't mean much these days, whether it be number of casualties on either side. But it is interesting to see that this number, 20,000, is actually written down in this communique.
Yes, I mean, I was struck by the fact as well that the International Criminal Court, in its investigations, has also scaled down the charges against Russia enormously from what was initially discussed, because I think they just could not find the evidence to support it.
Right.
Dan, do you see any shift in the US debate on this now? How much skepticism have you detected about this summit and about the Ukrainian demands?
Sure, thanks, Anatol. So I think in the US, I'm not sure that the peace summit has really, or the so-called peace summit has really registered very much in the American debate. I think it's telling that the president didn't even feel the need to attend personally, which suggests that the administration doesn't attach that much importance to this meeting itself. They sent Vice President Harris and Jake Sullivan, I think, to attend in place of the president. Given that the president was already there for the G7 summit, it was a little surprising that he didn't bother to stay. And so I think that indicates, even among supporters of administration policy, members of the administration themselves are not that invested in this process, or the start of the process that they were trying to get going. I think generally there is much more skepticism of administration policy as it relates to their reluctance or their resistance to any kind of diplomatic engagement, because there doesn't seem to be any other way out for the policy than to find some way to have talks, at least working towards a ceasefire. The fight to get the last appropriations through Congress, I think, was probably just a preview of what we can expect next year if there's a change in control in the White House. There will be a much tougher fight to get more military assistance to Ukraine going forward, especially if the Ukrainian government seems to be completely uninterested in any kind of compromise settlement. So that's I think that goes back to what John is saying, that this push for the summit may have actually backfired, in a sense, by showing how far removed the Ukrainian government is from where a lot of other sentiment is in the US and in some European countries.
But at the G7, there was, at least verbally, symbolically, a great show of support for Ukraine. John, how did you assess the impact of the G7 as opposed to the peace summit in Switzerland?
Yeah, this is an important question. I think there was more than just rhetorical support at the G7 conference. I think there were three steps that we saw that were taken mainly by the United States, because we're in the driver's seat here, that really matter. First of all, we doubled down on sanctions. Number two, we worked out this arrangement where we're going to loan the Ukrainians $50 billion. And then third, and most importantly, we worked out this 10-year security agreement with Ukraine. And this is enormously important because both Blinken and Zelensky said that this is a bridge, and I want to underline that word, this is a bridge to bringing Ukraine into NATO. This is guaranteed to enrage the Russians and guaranteed to make sure that this war goes on forever and ever. You don't take steps like this if you have any interest in trying to reach some sort of compromise agreement with the Russians. The Russians have made it manifestly clear since April 2008 that NATO expansion into Ukraine is categorically unacceptable. Many people in the West don't like that argument, but the fact is that is what the Russians believe. And every time we double down and talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO, it just gives the Russians an even greater incentive to, number one, take more territory, and number two, make sure that they do everything to wreck Ukraine. So I think the United States and its allies in the West live under the illusion that they're helping Ukraine, that they're going to make Ukraine's situation at the bargaining table down the road better than it is today. This is simply wrong, in my opinion. And in fact, what we are doing is guaranteeing that Ukraine is wrecked and that this conflict goes on for as far as the eye can see.
Yes, I mean, it has been argued that while in the fall of 2021, early NATO membership for Ukraine was not on the agenda, the military cooperation agreement signed between the US or announced between the US and Ukraine may have played a decisive role in deciding Putin to issue his ultimatum and then invade, because of course there are also forms of US military presence, and of course we now know about the strong presence of the CIA ever since 2014 that fall short of NATO membership, but are still considered in Moscow to be highly menacing. And could I ask, I mean, on this score, is there any pushback in Europe, or at least in Western Europe, against these US policies? And do you think, I mean, if the Rassemblement National wins these parliamentary elections, will this have a very important effect on French policy, or in fact will Macron ensure that French policy towards Ukraine remains unchanged for until the next French elections, presidential elections?
I'm sorry. No, I think it will have an important impact in as much as if the French president doesn't have a majority. Well, he won't have a majority, that's for sure. The RN will probably get a majority, possibly not a complete majority, but a very large one, and will be able to put a lot of pressure on the president. The president will still have lots of prerogatives, but he will not control the defense budget whatsoever. So he could push for all kinds of things, but he might not get them through just because of this particular aspect of his not controlling the budget. The RN has definitely said that it wants to support Ukraine, but not at the expense of what they call a suicide. They mean an economic suicide, they have distanced themselves thoroughly from Mr. Putin himself, because this is what's important to many people who watch television. I mean, either you're for Putin or you're against Putin. People don't necessarily think of the larger issues. And Putin has been on French television every day, almost all day long, to be of course, to be presented as the bad guy that he definitely is. But it has become a figure that everyone knows about in France. So the RN is determined not to be dragged into a very expensive support for Ukraine, because this is what it really comes down to. It's the money. They're finding themselves they're announcing that they will find themselves in front of a difficult financial situation for France, which is true. France's debt has exploded, and the agencies that give ratings to France have already gone down. So they will simply have to say, we have no money to support Ukraine any longer. But it's interestingly enough, they are not against sending French missiles, they have announced, to Ukraine, as long as they're not allowed to hit inside Russia. We've heard that before from other countries. So they've made this concession, if you will. We're not against sending missiles to Ukraine, possibly thinking that Ukraine would end up paying for them, which I'm not sure is true. But so here we are with the RN. However, there is a party, the Socialist Party, which now calls itself Public Forum, run by Raphael Glucksmann, the party under which the former president François Hollande has decided to run again for office, just as a representative. And that party, led by Raphael Glucksmann, who for a while was an advisor to Mr. Saakashvili during the Georgian conflict with Russia, is absolutely adamant that we must support Ukraine all the way. We must seize the 200-some billion dollars that belong to the Ukraine Sovereign Fund and use it to, this is over and beyond the interests that the Americans themselves have said could be used to help finance Ukraine's war. So it will depend a little bit on how well that party does in the polls, but Raphael Glucksmann has decided, has been forced to align himself with the most extreme far left party, which is that of the France Insoumise, which means the party of the insubordinates, which tells it all. With a fiery
and that is above all insubordinate to America.
Right. Well, a lot of people in France feel that they should sort of become somewhat more insubordinate to America. But that's a very complex question. Anyway, here we are. If the RN makes it, and chances are it will, unless there is, a real movement from the rest of the people who think that it's unacceptable to have a far-right party at the head of France, especially after they've criticized, in no uncertain terms, the ones that are existing in Italy and had existed in Austria before. Unless that happens, the far-right party is going to be at the helm in France, and that will change everything, definitely, for Ukraine. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Dan, it's generally thought that there will be no moves from the US towards negotiations until the next US presidential elections, assuming, of course, that there isn't a Ukrainian military disaster on the ground before then. But what about after the next US elections? Because as far as the Biden administration is concerned, I can't detect any thinking now behind the scenes of what a viable negotiating position would consist of. And I suppose as far as the Trump team is concerned, we just don't know, partly because, of course, there isn't a Trump team as such on international affairs. What are your views on this?
Well, no, I think you're right that if Biden were to win, there would still be the same resistance to pursuing a diplomatic path, same as we've seen the last 2.5 years. With Trump, I mean, he's made noises about making deals or cutting deals. I mean, he says this about almost every issue, that he would be able to find some way to make deals that Biden can't make. But I don't think that there's really anything to that. If we're looking at the people around him, the person who has been talked up or has been considered as his possible Secretary of State is Rick Grenell, who of course is very much a hardliner on most issues. I think he would prove to be very much a hardliner on this issue as well. And if someone like Grenell is in a top position in the Trump administration, I think we would see a U.S. approach that is, I think, for many people, surprisingly intransigent with respect to Ukraine. That there would be a lot more continuity with Biden's position than many people expect. Of course, it could be that Trump doesn't go with Grinnell and chooses to go in a different direction, but as of right now, that's who he seems to be promoting as one of his chief spokesmen, as one of the people that he wants to have close to him on these issues.
Anatol, can I jump in and respond to your question to Anne about European attitudes towards Russia and whether there's any prospect for change there, and make 2 points that suggest that it's highly unlikely. The first is, I think the Russophobia and the Putin phobia in Europe is so great that it is very hard to imagine how you can negotiate your way to some sort of meaningful settlement with the Russians. The fact is that to keep the Europeans on board, and here we're talking mainly about the European publics over time, what we did was we threat inflated and we portrayed Putin in the worst possible terms. He's the second coming of Adolf Hitler. We portrayed Russia as the second coming of Nazi Germany, the font of all evil, and so forth and so on. The problem that you face when you portray an adversary in these terms is that it becomes almost impossible to then negotiate some sort of meaningful deal because you're in effect dealing with the devil. So I think it's very hard to sort of turn the ship around in the water because of how we have portrayed Putin and Russia more generally. My second point that I would make is it's very interesting to watch the Europeans, but they live in mortal fear these days that the American security umbrella is going to disappear, that we're going to pivot to Asia and we're going to leave them high and dry. They understand full well that having the American security umbrella over their head keeps the peace in Europe by and large, and they want us to stay. But that means that they'll do almost anything we say. There was a piece in the New York Times recently by Stephen Erlanger that talked about how easy it is these days for the United States to get its way with the Europeans. And I believe it's due in large part to that. And of course, the United States is going to remain as hawkish as ever. That might change if Trump is elected, but that remains to be seen. It remains to be seen whether he'll get elected, and then how much that will matter. But assuming there's no sea change with Trump, I think the Americans will remain hawkish on Ukraine for the foreseeable future, and the Europeans will dance to our tune. So I think there's very little prospect that things are going to change in Europe anytime soon.
You would agree with that, Anne? Yes.
Well, your first point, Putin and the Russians being demonized in Europe, I'll tell you, it's not exactly true. There's a certain fascination for Putin as a strong man, of which there is some in the United States as well, I understand. Russia has a very good historical image in France. And in Germany, as you know, it has been a very close nation to Germany, no matter what happened during the war. I mean, during the Tsarist period, the whole mid-administration of the Tsarist regime was run by what they called Prussians at the time. And beyond that, there's a great interest in Russian literature, Russian films, and so on and so forth. And you have a whole category of people who listen to the French equivalent of Fox News, which is CNews in French. And those guys are completely against France getting involved in anything like supplying weapons or money to Ukraine, and they have a vast audience. They are really very much the equivalent of the in terms of the audience and in terms of what they push for, very equivalent to Fox News in France. So that's one element you cannot dismiss, because there are lots of radio stations and YouTube little shows that do not at all take the stance against Putin. However, having said that, of course, you know what Macron has finally discovered, that he was Russia's greatest enemy after trying to be, a mediator, and he's painted himself into a corner, and so have a number of European presidents and other people in high places. they've put themselves in a corner. They have talked so much about the morality and the international order and the necessity not to let someone take over territories by force that they really don't know what to do anymore. And now that Macron is in a very weak position in France, the whole situation could turn around on its head. And I wouldn't be so surprised if it were to happen, because as I said, there are basically very few French people who wish for Russia's victory. And on top of that, if my taxi drivers who take me to the TV shows I attend are anything to go by, they all say, well, you can never beat Russia. I mean, a lot of people say that in France. And remember, of course, that in France, a lot of the people who are now part of the far right were originally ardent communists. And of course, the relationship between communists and Russia, there's always something there. There's always this kind of nostalgia for the good old days of of communist friendships and togetherness. So it's not as simple as that. And of course, in Germany, it is very complex. In Germany, you have a relationship with Russia that has no equivalent anywhere else in Europe, and historically, and goes over a long period. And you have at least one party, this Bundessache Wagenknecht, which has absolutely no weapons to Ukraine, remove all sanctions against Russia, and she just got 6.8%, I think, in the European elections, which was a surprise to me. In Italy, of course, there is still an enormous amount of sort of old-fashioned, almost family support for Russia because of the Communist Party, even though Meloni has made it absolutely clear that she wants to support Ukraine. So all of this is complicated, and it is largely the heads of states in Europe that have painted themselves into a corner. For example, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, who will be re-elected for sure at the head of the Commission, has just said that what President Putin proposed was absolutely unacceptable and could never be accepted by Ukraine. So there you are. You have people at the helm making very categorical statements, leaving no room for ambiguity, in spite of Macron saying that he wanted strategic ambiguity. Well, his strategic ambiguity really consisted of telling Putin, maybe I'm going to send 4,000 French soldiers to Ukrainian soil, at which most French people recoiled in horror. So it's a complex situation because Europe is in a way more complex than the United States. And its relationships among each other and with toward other countries like Russia cannot be taken as similar. See what I mean?
On Putin's peace proposal, Dan, I mean, once again, I think one should put that in inverted commas. It is obviously quite unviable as it stands. But do you see any hopeful aspects to Putin's points at all?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how serious he is about the territorial issue. If he really does insist on Russia controlling all four territories that have been claimed, and technically they've claimed that they've annexed, even though they don't control all of them. If they really intend on that being their gain at the end of the war, and they're not going to budge on any of that, then yeah, I agree. It's pretty much hopeless. Where there might be some opening is to test them to see which of those territorial claims they're actually really wedded to, which ones they're prepared to stick with until the end, and which ones they're prepared to let go on. And I would think that there might be some room for compromise there, some room for negotiation, but you would have to actually test it and start talking to them about it. And unfortunately, I don't see any work going towards preparing for that, whether in Washington or in Kiev. So it doesn't look very good in terms of the prospects for making any progress, but there might be some opening there if we try to find it.
Can I jump in here, Anatol?
Of course, John.
I mean, I agree with Dan that the proposal is not viable at this point in time. There's no way the Ukrainians or the West is going to accept anything approximating the deal that Putin has put on the table. But I think the key point here to keep in mind is that the Russians believe that they're winning the war. They believe that the balance of power, especially on the battlefield, has shifted. And if you project out over the next year or two, it will continue to shift in their direction. And I think their basic view is that, of course, the West isn't going to accept this deal. The Ukrainians are not going to accept this deal. But we're going to basically force it down their throat. We're going to conquer more territory. We're going to do more to wreck Ukraine. And ultimately, they're going to have to accept something along the lines that we described in this peace proposal, or you'll have a frozen conflict in which we are sitting in a very excellent position. You want to remember that Putin made it clear in his 14 June talk that he was not interested in a frozen conflict. He wants a real peace agreement, and that makes perfect sense from his point of view. I think he's extremely unlikely to get it. I think he's going to make more conquests on the battlefield for sure. He's going to do more to wreck Ukraine and sow dissension in the West. I think he'll be successful on that front. But I think what he's going to end up with is a frozen conflict. He won't get a meaningful peace agreement. But I think that frozen conflict will be one that he can live with.
And by the look of things, looks as if in future it will be even worse for Ukraine, perhaps much worse for Ukraine, given the military situation, at least on the ground. I mean,
Absolutely. This is why I've argued all along that now is the time to cut a deal, minimize how much more territory the Ukrainians lose, number one, and reduce the number of Ukrainians who are killed on the battlefield. Trying to keep this war going, as we in the West are doing, is, in my opinion, strategically and morally foolish.
I mean, one question, I mean, sensible Russians I've talked to recognize that it would be impossible, in effect, to get any Ukrainian government or Western governments, formally and legally to recognize Russian sovereignty over these annexed territories. They have suggested, that this, as we have seen in Cyprus and Kashmir and elsewhere, this issue will simply be, deferred for future negotiation, which was, of course, as far as Crimea was concerned, Zelensky's own proposal at the start of the war. But Putin, of course, is now asking for formal recognition, which no, I mean, not a possibility. So some questions from the audience. From Germany, is there? Do you see any possibility of China, Brazil, India being able to introduce a viable set of peace proposals for negotiation, or will the United States and Ukraine continue to ignore such initiatives? Who has a view on this?
Go ahead, Dan. Go ahead. I talked before.
Okay, so my thought is that China might have had a good chance of doing this, except that now the Ukrainian government has come out very strongly against China and has been criticizing them publicly for what support they have provided to Russia, even though they could have provided a lot more than they have. That they have actually been quite limited in the amount of support that they've given their no limits partner. So it was interesting that ahead of the meeting in Switzerland, Zelensky was so pointed in attacking the Chinese and blaming them for undermining the summit, when it seems like it would have been more to his advantage to try to cultivate better relations with them. So I think any proposal coming from China now will be viewed as doing the bidding of Russia, or as being incredibly favorable to Russia, regardless of what the content of the proposal is. And so I'm afraid that while China would be in a good position to be a mediator because of its relationship with Russia, the Ukrainians are now seem to be very closed off to that.
A question, of course, especially since the latest New York Times article on the subject about the peace negotiations in Istanbul after the beginning of the war. John, do you think that they did stand a good chance of success? Were they doomed to fail? And just how important was the role of the US and Britain in bringing them to an end?
I would choose my words very carefully in answering your question. And that is to say, I think they stood a good chance of succeeding. I don't think they stood a very good chance. I think they stood a good chance. The two sides had made quite a bit of progress. And I think the Ukrainians were interested in shutting down the war, and the Russians were as well. So I think a deal might have been worked out. And I would argue that if the Americans and the Europeans more generally had backed the Ukrainians and pushed them to try to work out a deal, it's very possible that you would have gotten an end to this conflict immediately after it started. But of course, that didn't happen. And in my opinion, almost all the evidence says that it didn't happen because the West, and here we're talking mainly about the Americans and the British, intervened to tell the Ukrainians to walk away. And the Ukrainians, of course, did walk away. I think we did that in large part because we thought Ukraine could win, that we could defeat the Russians. At that point in time, the Ukrainians were doing quite well on the battlefield. The Russians looked like they were having lots of trouble. And furthermore, at that point in time, we thought sanctions would work to have a devastating effect on the Russian economy. And the combination of sanctions plus Russian defeats on Ukrainian battlefields would knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. And of course, we were not doing the fighting, the Ukrainians were. So it was easy for us and easy for the British to tell the Ukrainians to cut off negotiations. The end result is this disastrous situation that we face today.
There have been a couple of questions to me about Russian perceptions, or following on from my conversations with them. I mean, I would say that my strong impression, and this is backed up by opinion polls that have been accurate or have seemed accurate and reliable in the past, is that on the one hand, a large majority of Russians are not committed to war for complete victory, whatever that means. And of course, the idea of complete victory is also very vague on the Russian side. Putin's so-called peace terms do not actually involve complete Russian victory, which would be presumably the subjugation of the whole of Ukraine and much bigger territorial gains. Equally, though, the great majority of Russians appear opposed to anything that looks like surrender. And of course, existing Ukrainian peace terms, as backed by the West, do in fact, explicitly state that they involve complete Russian surrender and defeat in Ukraine. Strong opposition to that, both for patriotic reasons, but also because it is very widely thought that would lead to the collapse of the existing Russian regime and the drastic weakening of the state and a return to the chaos of the 1990s. So you are not going to get mass Russian support or protest for acceptance of existing Ukrainian and Western peace terms. No way. But on the other hand, in the unlikely event, as John has said, and as I think we agree, of the offer of a compromise peace, I don't think you would get much enthusiasm for continuing the war. The number of really hardline Russians, who do want to go for complete victory also appears limited. But as long as the only alternative is surrender, they will fight on. And of course, Putin has been very successful with tremendous help from us and also from Western rhetoric in convincing Russians that this is, in fact, not a war with Ukraine, but with the whole of the West, and that the Western US intention is, as John said, to basically eliminate Russia from the ranks of the great powers. So anyway, very briefly, those are my perceptions. On the years to come, Anne, do you see, because of course the next French presidential elections are due in 2027, an awful lot can happen between now and then. If the war is still dragging on, do you think that there is a chance of a much stronger backlash against continuing support for Ukraine in Europe and in favor of a compromise peace?
Well, it's a little bit hard to say. When talking about Europe, we have to contend not only with the local governments, the national governments, but we also have to contend with the European centers of power, the Commission, the European Parliament, and the last words we hear from the European organizations. The motto seems to be, there has to be a revolution of the mindset. And I'm quoting Joseph Borrell here, we have to speak the language of power. So the European Union is lining itself up regarding this conflict almost as a competitor with the United States, you see. And that is a little bit of trouble. A lot of people had convinced themselves that the Americans had already lost interest. I mean, this was in a way, the general idea that they would just, drop the Ukrainians, to put it plainly, and that Europe, and particularly France, and possibly with Germany, would take over. And I saw with my own eyes how, literally from one day to another, people who talk about peace all the time suddenly became extremely bellicose and militaristic. And I'm not just talking about the French, but about the Germans as well. I mean, you've noticed that the Germans are becoming interested in their own warlike past, and they've just instituted a Remembrance Day for their soldiers. I am not saying that it's good or bad, but I'm just saying this is a sign of the Germans looking at war in a completely different manner than what they've accustomed us to. It seems as if German young people, young men especially, are not completely averse to wearing a uniform again in defense of Ukraine or in defense of something else, I don't know. In France, the National Front has gotten the results that it has gotten through a lot of very young people who identify with the sort of strongman posture that this very young man who's leading the National Front, Jordan Bardella, who is 28 years old and might become the next French prime minister, and who, by the way, is the son of Italian immigrants. Perhaps he has a Napoleon what do you call it, the Napoleon syndrome. So he's much taller than Napoleon was, but Napoleon was also an Italian, and actually spoke French apparently with a very heavy Italian accent. And his mother didn't speak French at all. That's an anecdote. But this is to say that young people seem to be attracted towards the militaristic posture. Whereas at the same time, you have 82% of the French people who say, no, we don't want to send soldiers to Ukraine. Maybe it's just the prestige of the uniforms, as we used to say. But I think Europe is in for a lot of very substantial and possibly profound changes. I hope we don't rue the day when we rearm Germany, by the way, but that's another question perhaps. So I don't know. And the trouble is, if I may say so, the trouble is the United States. Because a lot of Europeans feel that they are becoming vassals to the United States, and the United States doesn't do anything to dispel that notion with the articles that it publishes in all kinds of very good scholarly magazines saying as much. And of course the arrival or return of Trump to the national U.S. scene has got everybody into a tither here in Europe, even though you already have, and this is a strange thing to witness, but there it is, you have a number of French people who would be ready to support Trump and who in fact are trying to, if not emulate him yet, imitate him. And I referred earlier to this channel, which is just like Fox News. I mean, perhaps I exaggerated a little bit, but it's a little bit make France great again by making it more militaristic and so on and so forth. And since on the other hand you have the French government and every other government in Europe in agreement with the idea that they have to reconstitute their defenses, the defense industrialization. So these two elements combined make for a future that looks considerably more militaristic to me than it has been for ever since the end of the Second World War in Europe. I may be totally wrong, but it is something that one feels is something of a trend. And also the position of the United States hasn't been clear vis-a-vis Ukraine. Even Biden's position, even Biden himself hasn't always been completely clear. And some people in his administration have been much more hawkish than others, as we know. The military was, in fact, more or less against giving weapons to Ukraine, and this, of course, was known in France. So it's strategic ambiguity is sometimes coming from the United States, and it creates confusion in everybody's minds, you see. So it is true, as John just said, that at the end of the day, everybody knows that it is the Americans who will decide the fate of Ukraine and possibly the fate of Europe, as they have in the past for the good. And there's a tremendous amount of frustration in that regard in Europe, all over Europe, I believe. So I don't know if I answered your question. I tried.
I mean, as a Brit, of course, I'm strongly in favour of splendid uniforms. I mean, the more feathers, the more furry hats, the more gold braid, the better. As long as it stops at that, and we don't end up with people wearing furry hats at Borodino. My own sense is that a good many of these younger people, if confronted with actual war, might think better of this militarism. But of course, I would rather not have them find that out in practice. John, a question from the US Senate actually about the Indo-Pacific US strategy and partnership. What, in your view, could be the effects of this on US policy towards Ukraine? I mean, so far, of course, we've seen Japan lining up, Australia with the US over Ukraine, but India has been very careful to keep a distance. Do you have any thoughts on how this might develop in future?
Yeah, it's funny that that question came up because what I wanted to jump in and say was we want to remember that Ukraine is one of three big flashpoints. Gaza's another, of course, and East Asia is the third. And you have to think about what's going on in Ukraine in the context of those two other arenas as well. And with regard to East Asia, I think, first of all, the United States has, to some extent, shortchanged East Asia because it's been so deeply involved in Ukraine, and now it's so deeply involved in Gaza. And given that the United States considers China to be the principal threat and East Asia to be the most important theater, this tells you something is wrong and that this balance or this imbalance has to be redressed. To take this from another perspective, what if we have a crisis involving the Philippines and China, and the United States gets dragged in, and the United States and the Chinese end up shooting at each other? I'm not saying that this is likely to happen, but it's a plausible scenario. One can tell all sorts of plausible stories about how conflict breaks out in East Asia. I believe if that were to happen, that would have a profound influence on how we think about Ukraine. And then if you go over to Gaza, the war in Gaza is, first of all, forcing the United States to divert a considerable amount of military assets away from Ukraine towards Gaza to the Israelis. This conflict shows no signs of ending. And it's not only a drain on military resources, more importantly, I think the American policy in Gaza is delegitimizing the United States and the West in very important ways. It's just causing all sorts of problems. You can see unrest beginning to percolate in Europe about what we're doing. Joseph Borrell, you can tell that he's very uncomfortable with Western policy in Gaza. So I would argue that given that the Gaza war is likely to go on as long as the Ukraine war, that this is going to cause us all sorts of problems vis-a-vis Ukraine. And furthermore, getting back to the question from the audience, I think if you think about the possible trouble that we might run into in East Asia, you can see where that will detract from our efforts in Ukraine as well.
And do you think that Gaza is going to have a really deep and permanent effect on European views of the United States?
Well, I think anybody who has a conscience, and that means a lot of people all over the world, cannot be but horrified by what took place on October 7th. And anybody who has a conscience cannot be but horrified by what's happening now in Gaza. Now, in France, a number of protests, movements took place, but a lot of them were stopped by the government, actually. And the Gaza war is not reported as well as it is in the United States. It doesn't, how can I put it? It isn't as present on the French media than it is on American media. And as you know, France has the largest Jewish population in Europe, and so of course it's a consideration for the government to take into account. It was actually one of the main points of that LFI, the France Insoumise, the insubordinate people, to make during this campaign for the next legislative elections. But they have been attacked in very, very violent ways against taking that stance, and have been accused of anti-Semitism at every turn. But of course, as I said, people's conscience is horrified by what happened in both instances, and it's something that will definitely have an impact. However, the political party that is likely to be at the helm is the National Front, and they are absolutely ardent supporters of Israel, primarily because, of course, their founder was a notorious anti-Semite himself. So it's certainly something that is in everybody's minds, and of course it also directly impacts Ukraine and Russia, because you cannot accuse Russia of crimes against humanity and think that it is unthinkable to accuse Israel of crimes against humanity. So it's not really I mean, it is a political question, but it is so much an emotional and moral question that it is difficult to analyze in political terms, because people will have to be at peace with their own conscience when they deal with that.
There's a question which I'll answer about whether it would be appropriate to threaten Russian sovereignty over Kaliningrad in response to, Russian self-declared annexations and aggression against Ukraine. And now, of course, in terms of justice, possibly, in terms of reality and Western and global interests, any serious threat of Western conquest of Kaliningrad, which is, Russian territory, would lead immediately to war, direct war between Russia and NATO. And if it looked as if we were winning, it would lead directly to nuclear war. Having visited Kaliningrad, all I can say is it was much nicer when it was Königsberg, apparently. I would really not risk the existence of humanity for the sake of Kaliningrad today. Dreadful place.
Well, can't turn over in his grave.
Indeed. Well, finally, several questions, I suppose fairly enough to us all, I will pass them on to you, about how, if it were in your power, what would you regard as a just and sensible settlement to the war in Ukraine? We have a few minutes left. Dan, I'll begin
Sure,
with you.
I'll give it a try. So if you could arrange it, I think if you would have some sort of UN UN sponsored referendum for determining the status of Crimea, so that everyone would accept the legitimacy of the outcome of that referendum. That might settle that question. Then you would need to have significant autonomy for eastern provinces in Ukraine to address any lingering resentments or concerns, grievances that the people there may have had towards the central government. Obviously, Russia would have to evacuate all of its troops from every other part of Ukraine, and there would probably need to be some kind of demilitarized zone or some sort of band of territory where the Russians couldn't directly threaten Ukrainian territory from, imposed or monitored by some sort of UN peacekeeping force. I don't know if all of that would be workable or achievable, but that would be my starting point.
John?
Well, you asked what would be a just and sensible settlement. I'm going to leave the word just off the table.
As befits a realist.
Sometimes as a good realist, I even can talk about what I think is a just settlement. But in this case, I just want to think about what is a sensible settlement, what we can hope for here. And let me just preface what I recommend by saying we're talking about actually getting a peace settlement, not a frozen conflict, okay? If you want a peace settlement, I think you have to do two things. One is you have to accept the fact that the Russians are going to annex Crimea and the 4 oblasts that they now almost control. You're not going to get them to give up those 4 oblasts. So you have to accept that. That's the territorial settlement. And then second, you have to not only create a neutral Ukraine and put an end to all this talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO, but you have to completely sever the security relationship between the United States and Ukraine. There can be no security relationship. Ukraine is got to be on its own. People may not like that, but there is no way you're going to get a peace settlement where Ukraine is linked in any meaningful way from a security perspective with the West, and especially with the United States. The Russians don't trust the Americans and the Europeans at all, given their past experiences, especially with regard to Minsk. And therefore, you have to create a truly neutral Ukraine that's severed from a security perspective from the West. And again, you have to accept the fact that those four oblasts plus Crimea are going to be formally incorporated into Russia.
Anne, very briefly.
Well, I agree partly with John, but I mean, you do have to give something to the Ukrainians who have very bravely fought back against the Russians. If you have to accept, as John just said, that they're not going to rule it over those four oblasts, what's in it for them then? So I'd like to think that we could go back to something like the Minsk agreements, but this time that they should be implemented. In other words, give give a voice to those people of the Donbass and the Donetsk and the Luhansk, who originally were absolutely horrified when Maidan took place, and they were considered, traitors, and because they'd voted for all of a sudden I forget his name. The fellow who had to get away and go to Russia. What was his name?
Yanukovych.
Yanukovych. They were left bereft. They'd voted for him. They had felt, they were part of more or less of Russia. They spoke Russian, whatever, even if they felt completely Ukrainian. I mean, all of this is something that should be looked at in detail. But in the end, how can the Ukrainians save face if Crimea and those four oblasts go to Russia? So you have to give them something. Now, John says they should be completely independent of the United States, but surely the neutrality of Ukraine should be absolutely made ironclad. And for that, you need the Americans and you need the Europeans. So there has to be some give and take. Otherwise, if Ukraine's security is not guaranteed, then one doesn't see why the Ukrainians themselves would stop fighting, because they would have to give everything up to the Russians, and in exchange they would get nothing. So you have to give them something, and I think what you have to give them is an ironclad security pact. Several countries have already signed a security pact with Ukraine, France, Britain, I think. If you don't want American footprints, maybe it's one thing, but at least European guarantees will both satisfy Ukraine and Russia in that case. If we give Ukraine a security guarantee, well, in a sense, it's a guarantee for Russia as well. And of course, a lot of people are talking, and I think Daniel just did, about referenda, finding out if those people in the Donetsk and the Luhansk still want to have something to do with Russia, or by now having been subjected to Russian bombs and the like, if they decided that their fate should be strictly Ukrainian and nothing else, and as long as they're allowed to continue to speak Russian, which is one of the demands that Putin made recently. That's the question I would have. You have to give them something. I think the Minsk agreement gave them something, but nobody was ready to implement them. But in a way, it was a good idea. This way, they would have those four oblasts would have had a certain amount of autonomy, sort of like almost a federal Ukraine, and possibly Russia would have been satisfied with that, because then it would have had access to the resource of that area of Ukraine, which are not what they used to be. What they used to be consequential in all kinds of areas. And by the way, I just want to say this. I mean, this is kind of like an anecdote, but I wonder if any of you have seen the YouTube statement by Lindsey Graham, growing absolutely extremely excited about the tremendous trillions worth of rare earths and other minerals that are under the Ukrainian soil, and he is getting all excited about how much this could bring to the United States in great commercial exchanges. And so, of course, the social networks immediately erupted with saying, "Ah, there is the real reason why we're supporting Ukraine." So this is just
A
a
reason,
small anecdote
not
in
the only
talking.
one. Well, thank
It's
you all
worth
so
looking
much.
at.
That was a fascinating and I hope very useful discussion. My thanks to the audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions. There are literally dozens of them, as you can imagine. So thank you all once again. I look forward to seeing you in future. And I hope that members of the audience will be able to attend our 2 events next week.